All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's panel, Identity and Cultures of Resistance in Printed Media. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Griffin Art Projects is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Musqueam, and Stolo nations. We are honored and grateful to undertake our work here. My name is Nathaniel Marchand, and I'm the Contract Curatorial and Marketing Assistant with Griffin Art Projects. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today for a live panel discussion with 4 Canadian artists, illustrators, and storytellers, Gord Hill, Rachel Lau, Jenny Lin and Cole Pauls. Today's program is scheduled in conjunction with the Griffin Art Project's current exhibition, Who's Chinatown? Examining Chinatown Gazes in art, archives, and collections. Guest curated by Karen Tam, on view at Griffin Art Projects until the weekend of May 2nd. We would like to thank the Richmond Art Gallery for assisting Griffin Art Projects greatly with the Who's Chinatown exhibition, as well as the North Vancouver Rec and Culture Commission and the Canada Council for the Arts. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. I would just like to mention that although you can see us, we can't see or hear you. So if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can type into the chat, or if you have questions for the Q&A portion of today's virtual program, you can type them into the Q&A option, which you'll notice is separate from the chat alongside the toolbar. If your question is not for all 4 panelists, you can indicate to whom you'd like it to be posed as well. If you would like the opportunity to ask your questions aloud, you can feel free to indicate that in the Q&A, and then we'll unmute you so you can ask your questions at the end of today's presentations. You'll also notice that we have Zoom's live transcription function enabled. So if you would like to see live captions displayed for today's presentation, you can enable this by selecting the CC live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. And I would like to note that although it is not perfectly accurate, and in particular, both place names and people names tend to be trickier for it to decipher, we do hope that it'll be helpful in capturing most of what we're saying. We're also going to record today's presentation, and we'll be posting it online afterwards, at which point we will go in and edit any of the captioning mistakes. So this recording will be shared within a week and will be available for viewing on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. So to begin today's virtual event, each panelist will share a short presentation highlighting some of their work, their practice, and the themes that they explore through various mediums. After all 4 presentations, we will open things up for a live audience Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to present today's first panelist, Gord Hill. So Gord Hill is an artist and activist of the Kwakiutl Nation of Northern Vancouver Island. He is the author and illustrator of several anti-colonial and anti-capitalist comic books and zines, including the 500 Years of Resistance comic book, the Anti-Capitalist Resistance comic book, the Antifa comic book, as well as 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance. His work exists at the intersection of art, history, and resistance, inspiring, educating, and motivating actions and philosophies, while contributing to an overall culture of resistance. Gord also runs the website Warrior Publications and was a frequent contributor to Briar Patch magazine. He has been active in the Indigenous peoples movement since the 1990s. Gord, thank you for joining us today.
Hello, thanks for having me. Yes, my name is Gord Hill. I'm from the Kwakiutl Nation. And today I was gonna kind of break the theme, the concept into 2 separate things: identity and art, and the culture of resistance. So for people on the Northwest Coast, where my people are located, the Kwakiutl, we have a kind of a distinct art form. It's generally called Northwest Coast art. And I just wanted to share some aspects of it because it's really it's a crucial part of our identity as Indigenous peoples. And each group along with like Xinjiang, we all have, it's a similar art form, but they're also very distinct and unique. And I'm just going to share some graphics. All right, hopefully everybody can see this. So this is kind of like an iconic image of Northwest Coast art, which is the totem pole. And I wanted to share this one to begin with because people are most familiar with it. But so this art form is has been developed over thousands of years. But the reason it's really important to our people is because it's a way that we maintained our history and our territory and social organization as well. So when people look at this, they might see that it's a thunderbird and a grizzly bear, but for us, these are actually our crest figures from our families, and they tell the story. They tell stories from our family's history. So it's how we maintain our history. So this is a totem pole. I believe it's by Stephen Bruce, who lives in Alert Bay. And this is a mask of a coulis, which is like a type of thunderbird. And the coulis is where my family, the Scow family, originates. When the coulis came down from the sky world, and he started the lineage. He landed on Guilford Island. And the thing about this is, like, it's not just a fantasy story, because this actually validates or affirms that this is our territory. This is where our first ancestor came down from the sky world and established our lineage. So this is a mask, and on the Northwest Coast, these carvings and masks, they were a way to bring into this physical world these supernatural and spiritual beings, so that the people, the children, and that would grow up and they could see these physical manifestations of beings that otherwise we would not normally see in everyday life. And it also helped maintain our social organization, because when we had potlatches, we could display these crests, and these crests gave us rights to certain territories. So it was a way of maintaining all the social organization and validating claims to territories and resources. So I'm going to switch to culture of resistance now. So people have probably heard of Frantz Fanon, who was a very well-known anti-colonial writer. He wrote The Wretched of the Earth. And one thing he talks about there is, he talks a lot about culture and cultures of resistance. And one thing he was talking about was, after a people have experienced colonization and they've basically been subjugated by a colonial power, what is left are the dregs of culture. And I mean, it's kind of a brutal assessment, but what he's saying is, like, after colonization, peoples hold on to aspects of their culture, but they're very minimal. And they actually enter into kind of like a colonized phase, and they might mix in Christianity or other aspects of the colonial culture. And Fanon's thing was that once people start resisting, that's when a culture of resistance is developed. So in this context, what I'm talking about, culture of resistance, is when people are opposing another group trying to come in and gain control over them or subjugate them. So Fanon's thing was that when people start to fight back, it actually reinvigorates their culture, and there's cultural renewal, and there's new forms of expression that evolve. And one of these, of course, is for Indigenous peoples in North America and other parts of the world, was the printed media, right? Because we didn't have printed media. We did our own art forms, like I was showing you to start with the carvings and totem poles and that. But once we enter into a colonized situation, then we have new forms of expression that are available and that begin to be adopted by people who are actually resisting the colonial power. And one of the people that really inspired me to start using my traditional art and just my artwork to contribute to resistance movements was Louis Hall, who was a Mohawk writer and poet. He passed away in the mid-90s, but he was very influential in re-inspiring the Mohawks to not only engage in acts of protest and resistance, but to actually reinvigorate their warrior culture. So he was a very strong proponent of reorganizing the warrior society among the Mohawks to protect their land, their people, and their culture. And so some of the things he developed, you're probably familiar with, is the warrior flag. And this is like a new, it's a new form, a new cultural form that's been developed. And along with the flag, he did a lot of paintings in that. And he also wrote the Warrior's Handbook, which kind of had a big influence on the evolving Mohawk resistance through the 1970s, through the 80s, and up till 1990, which of course was the Okra crisis. And he had some really good ideas that influenced me a lot. Like he talked about the people need to have a warrior spirit in order to have the will to resist. exist and to emphasize warrior culture, rebuilding the warrior society, and just generally like and changing the concept of how you view things. So he talked about not calling yourself a tribe, but referring to yourself as a nation, because tribe had negative connotations, that it's like primitive and all of that. So he talked about using different terms. Like talk about nation. So it's not the Mohawk tribe, now it's the Mohawk Nation or the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation. And he talked about the territory. So the colonized people have been put on reserves. So he said, don't call them reserves, it's still your territory. So he started using the term territory. So you're on the Mohawk territory. So if he talks about the Kahnawake Reserve, he calls it the Kahnawake territory. And to me, these are important ideas because they're really vital to a culture of resistance, transforming the mind of colonized people and inspiring and motivating them to take part in acts of resistance. And so taking my inspiration from Louis Hall, I began to use my art and incorporate traditional art forms as well, beginning maybe in the 1990s after Oka. And so that's what I've been doing over the years. I did the 500 Years comic book, because to me, the history is a really important part of a culture of resistance. Because if people don't know their history, they don't know, for example, how their people were colonized, and they're vulnerable to the colonial history, which is going to be distorted. And another aspect of colonial histories is that they minimize, a lot of times they minimize the indigenous resistance. So to me, the history of resistance is a really vital part of a culture of resistance. So I've dedicated a lot of my time to kind of maintain resistance. So that's what my comic book, the 500 Years of Resistance comic book, published by Arsenal Pulp Press, that's what that was about. You know, I'm trying to, and I find the comic format to be really accessible to a lot of people, young people and to older people who might have a hard time reading, like reading long history books, like textbooks and that. So I found the comic book format to be really, really helpful and really accessible to people. I use other art forms as well. I do silkscreen prints. I do a lot of posters and stickers and stuff like that. But my main thing right now I'm working on is comic books. And actually right now I'm working on a revised version of the 500 Years comic book. It's going to be in full color, published by Arsenal Pulp Press in the fall of 2021. So I think I'm just going to wrap up my discussion there. Yeah, it's unfortunate I wasn't able to share more of my graphics, but I would rather just share the information that I had. And I'll just stop now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gord. That was super well said. I really enjoyed what you're saying about the terminology too, the power behind certain words, and also the accessibility of the comic art form. I mean, something to consider, that you can make something powerful, but if it can't be accessible for all sorts of different people, different walks of life, then it's not changing things as much. So thanks so much for sharing that and for being so well spoken with that. There's some great comments as well. People loving your comic book, saying it was so great, and excited to read the reworked version as well. Our next panelist actually also made a comment, Rachel. So we'll just jump right into the next presentation here, I think. So Rachel Lau is a multidisciplinary artist, writer, and radio producer based in what's colonially known as Vancouver. Through audio storytelling, film photography, and zine making, they contemplate what it means to experience longing in a world that is transient. They believe that creating and communing with one another is both a salve and a tool of resistance against the oppressive structures of imperialism, white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. Rachel is co-librarian of Queer Reads Library, a mobile library of independently published queer books and zines based in Hong Kong and Vancouver and presented internationally. They were also the project coordinator for the 5-part radio documentary project, Speak My Language, an intergenerational storytelling project which highlights the experiences of Chinese elders facing barriers to access in the British Columbia healthcare system. Rachel is a recent graduate of the Media Studies program with a minor in Asian Canadian Asian Migration Studies at the University of British Columbia. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Cool. Thanks, Nathaniel. I just want to start by saying that I'm very excited to be on this panel. I am a big fan of Gord, Jenny, and Cole's work. I have all of their books in my library, in my personal collection, so it's really amazing to be able to speak alongside them. And thank you so much, Gord, for talking about your work as well as cultures of resistance that have existed in your communities for so long. So I'm going to share my screen now and share my slides. Okay, here we go. Okay. So, as you know, my name is Rachel. And I wanted to share a little bit about this idea of identity and resistance and culture first. So, a big part of my work that's inherent is just talking about my own identities and the way that my identities inform my work and all aspects of my life. And so as a queer, non-binary, Cantonese, Han Chinese artist, I think that those identities that I really hold dear to my heart inform the way that I make work as well as the way that I move through the world. And so here is a photo of me and my lovely, beautiful queer friends at March on Pride, organized by Black Lives Matter Vancouver. And so some of the work that I do in the Lower Mainland is to support queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. In addition to that, I also organize and support the community of Vancouver's Chinatown. And so this photo is taken in front of Vancouver City Hall, and it was a couple years back, I want to say 2017, but my memory's fading me a little bit. But this was a historic victory where the 105 Kiefer Street condo development was turned down by Vancouver's City Hall after a lot of resistance and pushback from the community. And so you see the elders up front and they're cheering, and I'm somewhere hiding in the crowd in the back with my fist up probably. So the reason why I mention that is because I think that these communities that I'm a part of and that I organize with and support are a big part of my art practice. So fast forward. In 2018, I moved from so-called Canada to Hong Kong, which is my father's hometown and a place that I visited quite a bit as a child. And that's when I really got my start in printed matter. And so when I was there, I continued the work of being in community with people that I identify with. And so this is a photo of me with Amnesty International Hong Kong's LGBTI group. And next to me is my great friend Vinci, who's also an artist and a singer-songwriter. And so this is some of the work that I was doing in terms of organizing or activist work. And in Hong Kong was when I really started to get into printed matter through meeting some friends who were also fellow zinesters or printed matter artists. And so here you'll see a couple of zines that I made during my time in Hong Kong. So on the left, that's a self-portrait of me, and it's a zine called Please Mind the Gap, which is a compilation of drawings that I had done while I was riding the MTR, which is the light rail in Hong Kong, and just thinking through a lot of the isolation I was feeling in this big city and being away from home, but also in a place that is somewhat home, given that it's my father's hometown. And on the right is a zine and a poster that I created called Ways to Waste Time at Work. And the zine is called Work, 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 打工仔. And this was a zine reflecting on how shitty it was to have a 9-to-6 job in this huge, like bustling, hyper-capitalistic city. And you'll see in that poster, just ways to waste time at work. Like, you poop at work, use the copier for free, read some articles, text your friends. And so I actually made that poster and those zines, I photocopied them at work. So that was kind of satisfying, like a way to say, like, stick it to capitalism. So those are some examples of work that I made when I was in Hong Kong. And that was really what got me started. And when I was in Hong Kong, I was really lucky to have the pleasure of combining the organizing work that I was doing with the queer community and being a queer person myself in Hong Kong's queer community, as well as my newfound love of printed matter and books and bookmaking. And so that brings me to my next part, which is Query's Library. And so Queries Library began when my friends Caitlin Chan and Beatrix Pang started this mobile library of queer books and zines in light of 10 LGBTQ themed books being banned by Hong Kong Public Library. So they were put on closed shelves, and people who want to read them need to give personal information to the library in order to be able to read them. And so essentially you're kind of putting yourself on a hit list. You don't really know what they're going to do with that information. And so amidst that absurdity and censorship, Beatrix and Caitlin started Queer Reads Library. And at first I was a reader, but over time we built a relationship, myself and Caitlin and Beatrix, and then I became a collaborator. So starting in 2019, I became a co-librarian of Queer Reads Library. And so the way that we mainly share the books in our library is mobile. So we have pop-ups. So you'll see on the right, we were at the Hong Kong Queer Literary and Cultural Festival. And so there's some fellow readers reading our books and zines. And on the left, we had a talk with some local artists and activists about queer visibility, as well as why printed matter matters, which is what we're talking about today. And as we continued to do our work as a mobile library, where we were building space for queer people and being able to document our histories as well as our cultures through printed matter, we also started hosting workshops. And so one of the more prominent and significant workshops that we hosted was actually the Queer Lexicon workshop. And why this is significant is because we actually started to have conversations as a team about the language that's used by queer people and the vocabulary that we use to identify ourselves, as well as to connect with one another, and how ephemeral and transient that is. And so we really wanted to be able to document that culture that is seemingly fleeting. And primarily we wanted to focus on queer people in Hong Kong, as well as Chinese speaking queer people. And so here you'll see on the right is a group mind map that we created documenting the terms that people use. And so there's terms for lesbian folks who use, and trans folks, and also like things having to do with bad sex, bad queer sex. And so that's all documented there. And you'll see on the left that those are the participants of the workshop. And I think what was really special about that workshop is that we were able to bring together folks who identified across the LGBTQ spectrum, as well as across generations. And so we had activists who were more active during the 80s and 90s that were organizing in Hong Kong. And then we also had really young folks who were still in university, and they were talking about their experiences and everything in between. So as we all know, and probably why we're gathered in this particular format today, is because, well, the pandemic hit us. And so COVID-19, when it hit so-called North America, I think that really changed the way that I approached my own artistic practice. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that I started creating during the time of the pandemic. So not only were we not able to gather in the ways that we usually do, like book fairs, for example, or in the case of Queer Reads Library, different pop-up events, I started to think a lot about what it meant to resist isolation, as well as resist complacency and acceptance of what was happening to us, and the failure of governments and institutions to take care of people during the pandemic. And so I created a lot of work last year, not because I had more free time at home or that I suddenly felt like making more work. I created a lot of the zines that I made because I needed to survive. And that was the way that I made it through, was being able to create zines. And so you'll see a bunch of my work that I created in 2020, but I wanted to talk about a couple of works in particular. Oh, this part of the slide is not show anyway. Oh, that's not helpful. Okay. Well, there was supposed to be a photo here, but it's not there, so that's okay. I'll just go back so you know which one I'm talking about. So the panel on the far right with the flames and the lightning, and also at the bottom right that says "Change with Me," that is a particular zine that I created based off of the Chinese bakgua. And the bakgua is used in a lot of aspects of Chinese culture, not only in traditional Chinese medicine, but also in sort of predicting one's life trajectory and what will happen in their lives. And so I created this particular project because I wanted to turn to culture to think about the current state of the world and also the balance in the universe and how to move forward. And so the reason why I named it Chained with Me is because a big part of the bakwa is actually defined by its constant movement and dynamism and also change. And essentially the crux of the bakwa is the fact that change is the only constant. And so I really wanted to use that as a way to express that this is the kind of wisdom or guidance that was coming from my culture to think through what was currently happening. So that was Change with Me, or Tindeyamo. It was supposed to be an image there, but oh well. And so the next zine that I wanted to talk about is actually Taipei in Blue, or Lamsik Dik Toipak. And so this zine in particular was created using photos that I had taken in 2018 when I visited Taipei. And this was during the time when I was living in Hong Kong. And at the time, I had these photos that turned out entirely blue because the film had expired. And I didn't really know what to do with them. And I was trying to create this zine called Taipei in Blue, but I felt stuck because I didn't find the sort of meaning behind the color blue. And it wasn't until the pandemic hit that I started to feel the sense of longing and also grief around the fact that I wasn't able, or I wasn't sure when I'd be able to visit Taipei again, or Hong Kong for that matter. And then the color of blue made sense to me. And it was during this time of isolation that I was able to put the zine together because it made sense to how I was feeling at that time. So you see on the right that I have a quote from Rebecca Solnit, and it says, "Blue is the color of longing for the distances you never arrive in and for the blue world." And so that's Taipei in Blue. Oh no, it's not. Okay, there we go. I was like, no, this is the third slide that's not loading. Okay, so in my room, I'm actually in my room right now at home, which is also my home studio. The reason why I want to bring up this zine, and this zine is a collaboration with my good friend Tim Fernandez. So we created this zine as a way to reflect on the time that people were spending in their rooms at home, either alone or with the people that they were living with. And I noticed that a lot of what people were talking about was that they were spending a lot of time with their own thoughts and feelings, especially thoughts and feelings that they didn't want to confront. And so I was really interested in this idea of spending a lot of time in your room in a certain space. And not only was I talking about the room physically at home that you were spending in, but also this idea of entering the room of your own mind and kind of revisiting things that are difficult to think about, and you need to confront yourself and all your fears and all these feelings, and just that journey through those different rooms of your mind. And so this zine was really quite a reflection on the time that I spent in isolation or quarantine, and also just experiencing the pandemic in general. So back to Queer Reads Library. One of the things that's kind of interesting and bizarre about the pandemic is that we're all trying to figure out how to share printed matter with one another without being in person, because I think a lot of printed matter artists would say that the importance of printed matter is actually a lot of the times the physical thing. So being able to hold it, being able to interact, being able to trade with one another. And so one of the things that we needed to navigate as Queer Reads Library was figuring out how we can share printed matter with others in a way that replicates that kind of intimate in-person experience, while also being able to make it accessible during the time of the pandemic. So some of the ways that we figured out how to do that was to do online events as well as our website. And so on the left, you'll see a photo of our beautiful panelists from the Queer Reads Library Show and Tell at Vancouver Art Book Fair last year. And so the way that we hosted that event was that the artists talked about their process and they would show us their books like an elementary school, like show and tell. And that was a really lovely thing because I think people really got an intimate look into the zine without necessarily being able to read the zine in person. And on the right, you'll see a beautiful promotional image that my teammate Caitlin made of our website, Queer Reads Library's catalog. And this is a documentation of all the zines that we have in our library, which I think at this point is more than 200 titles across Hong Kong and Vancouver. And although the full zine is not available for reading, we thought that it would be important to document and catalog all the zines that we have so people are able to access the zines and be able to read the content despite us not having pop-ups at this time due to the pandemic. So this is the last part of my presentation and a project that I feel really proud of that the Queries Library team worked on. And so this is some photos from our exhibit at Woman at the Chinese Culture Center of San Francisco. And we had the pleasure of collaborating with a fellow zinester and artist, Jay Wu. And so Jay helped us install this beautiful, amazing exhibit. And so you'll see on the left that the zines are actually in a glass case. And originally our idea was to have a reading room, but obviously due to the pandemic, that wasn't possible. And so we had to pivot and think of how can we share the printed matter in a way where people can still experience it. And you'll see on the wall that there are these beautiful, colorful papers that are actually scans of excerpts from the zines that were curated by Jay. And in addition to that, we were able to have Jay record themselves reading excerpts from each zine as well as their reflections on the zine. And so you'll see the website link at the bottom. That's where you can access those recordings. And on the right is actually our queer lexicon. And you might remember earlier from our presentation, the workshop that we had done. And so the queer lexicon is actually a culmination of all that work, working with our communities and compiling the vocabulary that we were all shared. And so the Queries lexicon was designed by Tiff Chan, based in Hong Kong. And it's a sort of taste of the vocabulary that we were able to collect in the lexicon. But in the spirit of accessibility and also being able to be in community during the pandemic, we also created an online queer lexicon that is ever growing. So people are welcome to contribute to the lexicon whenever they want and be able to see the terms that people read. So that's the end of my presentation, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about how those things all come together. And I think that as, like I said, a queer Chinese person, I think that the printed matter is such an important way to document not only my own autobiographical and personal experiences moving through the world as who I am, but also I think through the work of Queries Library, we're able to document the narratives and history of queer people and the life of resistance that we've been living for, since forever. And it's been such a pleasure to be able to work on the Queries Library project as well as my own practice. So that's me. And thank you so much for listening. And also here are my handles and my email. So let's keep in touch.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rachel. That was a great presentation. It's always super interesting to see how creative types have been adapting throughout the pandemic as well, not only as an artist working from home, but when you're involved with something like the Queries Library that's reliant on pop-ups and community, how to kind of navigate that. And I really like visualizing the idea of kind of a show and tell story time over kind of a video like this. It's super fun to think about. So thank you for that presentation. I think we'll just keep things moving here and jump into our next presentation. So Jenny Lin will join us next. And Jenny is an artist based in Zhujiage or Montreal, who works with experimental narrative and autobiographical fiction, primarily in the form of print-based installations, artist books, and zines. Since 2009, she has worked collaboratively with Eloisa Aquino as B&D Press, creating zines, print, and zine-inspired installations, and facilitating zine-making workshops with a focus on queer, feminist content, and queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color identities and histories. Lin was involved as a core member of Couleur Collective, a member of Articule's Fabulous Committee, and co-founded the Queer Print Club at Concordia University, where she teaches as a sessional instructor in print media program area. Jenny, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Nathaniel. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And I'm also very excited to be on this panel with artists that I truly admire, all of your work. So I'm going to just open the share screen before I forget to actually, and then here, I hope that you'll be able to see this PowerPoint. And I'll just open to this first slide. So today I wanted to talk about my own individual work, but then also I wanted to talk about the collaboration that I do with my partner, Eloisa Aquino. So we have this like a micro press called B&D Press that we've had since 2009. we self-publish our own work and then have published also the work of a few other queer artists. So we're two queer artists of color, a couple, and then also collaborate on different works like zines and installations. So with Eloisa's work, I'll just show, so this is just some of the examples of our zine works. And then Eloisa works mostly with nonfiction zines, so such as the series called The Life and Times of Butch Dykes, which is a 12 issue series of drawings and text, and highlights the lives of queer individuals who during their time defied society's expectations of gender identity and representation through the ways that they live their lives. And I mostly work with nonfiction, or sorry, I'm like, I'm reading notes, so I'm kind of a bit nervous and reading the wrong thing, but I work with mostly autobiographical narrative, and sometimes I combine together fiction or bring in some plot lines or tropes that are linked with particular types or genres of fiction. I'm really inspired by the format of zines that are called perzines. So kind of looking at personal stories and having the zine maker be able to tell a story from their own personal perspective and experience. Because I believe that in telling our own personal stories, it also prompts other people to share and tell their stories. So often I will work and, or maybe always I'll work in a way that I feel is a way of processing and recording what's happening in my life. And I think it's really important as well in my own work to acknowledge my own perspective, which is, I know, specific, but also can be limited in scope. So just sort of identifying the fact that it's not the only story, or nor is it the only perspective available. This is a zine called The Queers that I made in 2015, and it's based on this true experience where we went, my partner Eliza and I went traveling with a couple of good friends, and we were staying in a place together that I thought was haunted, and I made this like horror story, like a kind of like an autobiographical fictional gothic horror zine, because at the time, I guess like I had a lot of anxiety, as did my partner too, because we were worrying a lot about her health because of this undiagnosed illness. And I guess like in general, there was just this feeling that like this feeling that something horrible was going to happen. And it was hard to, like, it was unnamed at that time. And I decided to just kind of try to make a story about it by going through this sort of horror fiction format. So in this case, like, I guess I was like playing off of the fact that some gothic horror fiction doesn't mention queerness, like it uses queerness as the horror that goes unnamed, and or queer love, that is, sometimes. But I guess like I wanted to try to use the word queers over and over again to identify that we were strangers in this place, and that maybe the story was being told by an observer who was possibly like homophobic or hostile or just detached. And then I guess like the actual horror, like to give a spoiler, nothing actually happens, but I guess like there were just like all these different occurrences that made the place feel haunted, because I was already very anxious and jumpy. So here, I'll just kind of skip through. So I work with zines, or I enjoy working with the zine format because of its accessibility. And I think like also making zines, I've observed that like when you're showing zines and showing how to make them in workshops, I find that a lot of people really are encouraged to make their own zines by seeing other people's works. And then that zine making, or sorry, here I'll just like look at this, that basically by people representing themselves when there's a lack of representation that you're able to kind of see oneself and one's own community in printed matter. And I really think that that's very important. So Eloisa and I do our own work and self-publish, which gives us a lot of freedom in terms of like what the content is and how we produce and distribute the work, because we don't have to rely on an outside publisher. And then working in printed matter also allows a kind of platform that I find can fit into, but then also escape a lot of different types of spaces. So like we work within art galleries or art fairs or zine and community-based fairs often. Sorry, I keep toggling back and forth, but this is a work that is kind of related in imagery and content with the queers, but it's this wordless zine that's a folded double-sided format. And I think I like in particular the fact that people can hold your zine, like they will touch the work and then be able to handle it. And it has like this kind of like one-to-one sort of communication or connection with the viewer. This is a kind of like just sort of not so much like a clear narrative, but it's more like a kind of capturing like a mood that kind of carries through all of the panels. And then was a work that was about anticipatory grief, and then just trying to like process through like a shift in perspective, and then also, yeah, just coming to terms with an illness that was anyways like that we were just both trying to process together as a couple and as individuals. But I also thought that by having a large full-scale image on the other side, that it would be kind of a way of showing like a stepping out of the process, or like a kind of it is processed and that you come out of it with a different sort of view or point of view, I guess. So these two next projects are works that Eloisa and I made in collaboration. So there are these installations where we were trying to think about the 3D installation space as a kind of expanded zine. So this is made for the Queer Arts Festival in Vancouver. And we were trying to like think of how to make like a queer iconography, and got a bit frustrated by the process and decided more to kind of like focus on our own kind of iconography as a queer couple. So there's a lot of kind of like references to our own preoccupations or our own inside jokes or references within. Those are some of the images of things that were kind of like taken from references of the zines, and then also just like these 3D objects that we made for the installation. And those are two of the, so there's like two different zines that are part of this project. I'll just click through sort of relatively quickly. So this other project is a work we made for a group show where the artists involved were responding to the Gay Archive of Quebec, which is the one in Montreal. And I guess like we were kind of like looking at the minutes of this former queer bookstore in Montreal. And then from there, we kind of started looking at like the Canadian censorship laws that have affected the passage of queer books across borders, particularly like mostly it was like between the States and Canada, but also in different circumstances as well. And that these laws were basically like kind of pointing to the discrepancies in judgment around sex, and then also looking at queer sex as a way of like kind of considering or labeling it as immoral or obscene or indecent. So we looked at some of the actual examples of books that had been withheld at the border, or held at the border, I should just say, and then decided to draw these covers, and then also wrote these different texts. Like some of the texts were things that we were quoting from things that we had read, or just like different kind of references that came up that we felt were related. And then I guess like all of this sort of pointed also to a little bit of research about the lawsuit, or like with Little Sisters Emporium, that went to a Supreme Court ruling that adjusted the definition of obscene material, and then also just opened things up about about these censorship laws and so on. But through this, like we also ended up making this work into a zine like this. Or not a zine like this, it is that zine. So recently, like I guess since the pandemic started, I found that I was using drawing as a way of just kind of processing the whole experience of going through this is for mostly the first wave of the pandemic. So maybe similarly to what Rachel was talking about, using work as a way of like kind of surviving, but then also processing what like trying to come to an understanding of what was happening. So I would post these on Instagram, and then almost daily. And just I found the thing that I liked about it was that it also like kind of opened up like a way of communicating with friends, like so just having something to talk about online, and that made it feel like a little less isolating. So I would basically like make a drawing based on something that I would see, like either during my daily walks or just something I had read or heard about. So there's also references to like the different incidences of anti-Asian racism, and then the issues with the long-term care facilities that's been a pretty tragic across the country. And then also there's also like a lot of references to the reckoning or the uprising protests after George Floyd's murder, and just looking at the protests and reckoning towards systemic racism, oppression, and police violence. So I would kind of like make a drawing and sometimes write like either longer or shorter text to go along with these two. I'll just click through just because I think it will take too much time to read through. But then more recently, I guess I shifted towards like working with personal memory, and then also dreams, because I realized the pandemic itself, like on a larger scale, was feeling a little bit daunting to try to respond to. I just felt that I was kind of like more like closing in onto my own kind of family history or dream space instead. So I'm gonna just read one comic as a way to end, but oops, I forgot to mention, so like this is a series, like, so since I'm posting on Instagram a lot, I use this kind of square format and then 9 panels, so then I can use the 10th panel limit to show the entire layout of the comic. But I also made this series of paper zines that are in this kind of meandering format to try to like mimic Instagram in a little way. Yeah, so this is, I'll just read this then. So our grade 2 teacher had been reading Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator to us. I'm not going to read the racist text because I don't want to, but when it was time to go home, R repeated a line from the book over and over while heading to the doors. Passing by a dad who was picking up his daughter after school. The daughter was in another grade, but I'd seen them around before. He sometimes wore a plaid shirt like my dad's. This dad said, "Hey, don't say that. You better watch out. You better wash your mouth with soap." Looking confused, R ran away from there. I've pegged R as a racist all these years. But actually, we were all prompted to laugh at that part of the book by our teacher. So thank you for listening. And that's my Instagram handle if you wanted to check out some of my comics and drawings and things, and then also my website. So thanks so much for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. That was great to see all those variety of projects you've been taking on. And yeah, I think it's important to note too that recognizing identity through other people's creation can often be a way of establishing your own identity. And I think it's important to recognize that not only in printed media like we're discussing today, but in television, film, all sorts of things. And I think it's also very cool the way that you're kind of recognizing the format and the limitations of Instagram and using that in your work. We are running long today, but that's all right. I do want to remind you all to get your questions into the Q&A. We have one more presentation coming up with Cole Pauls, and then we'll put some time aside to get to your questions. So Cole Pauls is a Vancouver-based Halton comic artist, illustrator, and printmaker, originally from Haines Junction, Yukon. Currently, his primary focuses are on his 2 comic series, Pizza Punks and Dakwada Warriors, the latter of which is a bilingual graphic novel written in English and Southern Tachoni. In addition to being a creative resource for language revitalization, Dakwakad Warriors, I'm pronouncing that wrong, I'm sure, but Dakwakada Warriors.
Aquakada.
Thank you. I've been practicing all day, but can't quite get it. Also serves as an allegorical sci-fi representation of colonialism. Pauls has received awards for Best Comic and Best Zine from Broken Pencil Magazine, as well as Best Work in Indigenous Language from the Indigenous Voices Awards. He has received a BFA in illustration from Emily Carr University. Cole, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem. I'm really excited to be here. Like everyone else has said, I'm a huge fan of Gord. I am so grateful that he did a pinup for my graphic novel Dakwada Warriors. And Rachel and Jenny are just, such kind human beings that I'm super happy to share this virtual stage with everybody. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump into it since we only have a few minutes. Like Nathaniel said, I'm most known for my book, Dakwada Warriors, which is a language revitalization comic. So there's about 120 Southern Shoshone words in this book. And originally it was a risograph comic. And it was self-published. And something that Rachel said really stuck with me. And they said they made their zine out of the need to survive. And I felt very similar when creating Dakwada Warriors, because at the time I had just finished my degree at Emily Carr, and I was taking a break from my first comic, Pizza Punks. And I wanted to create something that like connected me back to the Yukon and to connect me back to my culture, and to kind of like reinforce like the identity I had as a child into here in Vancouver, because I had been living in Vancouver at the time for 4 years, and I was starting to feel a disconnect between my culture and my people. So I created this book, and it's essentially about 2 native Power Rangers, a wolf and crow, and they fight against an evil pioneer and a cyborg Sasquatch. You can see here that in the Southern Shoshone, I have it all numbered in the order that the words appear in the book, and then there's the translation below each text bubble. So the reason why I included Southern Shoshone in my work was because I wanted to not only like use my culture, my form line, Yukon Indigenous art, but I thought it was really important to include the language. And part of that was from being in a dance group as a child. I was a part of the Dakwada Dancers, which is in Haines Junction. It's a traditional song and dance group. I named the book Dakwada Warriors after the Dakwada Dancers. Dakwakada is also the traditional name of my hometown, Haines Junction. And Dakwakada, the word, means high cache. And for those who don't know what a high cache is, it's kind of like a cabin on stilts, and it's used as like a storage device for food or valuable materials like hide or tools, pretty much anything you wouldn't want to get taken by anyone or to be eaten by like a bear. You would put in a dakukata to cache it away. So I incorporated a lot of form line in my book, Dakota Warriors, but not necessarily a lot in my other work. And I wanted to really enforce the form line in this book because a lot of indigenous history and culture, like our folklore and stories, involve these places and objects having characteristics and even voices and opinions about situations that are happening on the land. So the sun, the moon, and the earth all have form line, and they all have faces, and they all kind of react to the things that are going around in my book. Another thing I really wanted to enforce in my work was the traditional colors of the Southern Shoshone people, which are black, white, and red. And it's, that's a pretty common color combination for West Coast form line. So I really wanted to just stick to that format to, kind of like reinforce my people's culture into my comic. I'm just gonna skip ahead of Dakota Warriors now because I've talked so much about it, and I think it's a really important body of work. But I'm currently 2/3 done my latest graphic novel, which won't come out till next spring, so like a year from now. But it'll be published through Conundrum Press again, and it'll be called Quandar. And for those who are maybe familiar with my work, I published a zine a year ago called Quandar, and it was kind of like a short story collection and some illustrations. But I'm gonna just completely expand on that and make a whole book now. And it's a lot of comics that are like standalone strips or maybe like 4 to 6 to 8 pages long. And they're all going to mainly be about Indigenous issues or just like Indigenous comics in general. So here's an example of that is my comic about Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. So for those who don't know, Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow was a land claims document that was presented to the Parliament in Ottawa in 1973 by Elijah Smith, Harry Allen, and Dave Joe, and a whole bunch of other Yukon First Nations chiefs. And you can see in the panel right here, this was taken from a photo of everyone in front of Parliament. And essentially, all these Yukon First Nations came to the Canadian government and demanded their land back, and we demanded, human rights. Essentially, like we asked to be treated like humans on our own land. And because of this land claims document, this is the reason why we have self-governing nations in the Yukon. So this was enforced or like started was presented, I should say, in 1973, but it wasn't enforced and like established until 1993 of September. So to like put that in perspective, I was born in August 1993, and I grew up thinking that Champagne-Ajac First Nations, my First Nations band, was like a normal thing. I was like, yeah, Indigenous people have nations and we're a part of a group and we have our own government, and it was like totally normal to me. But it wasn't until I was in high school that I learned about this land claims document, and I was like, whoa, my band, like Champagne-Ajac First Nations, legally isn't a thing until like I was a month old. So I'm like 1 month older than my First Nations band. And a lot of people think that this history is in the past and it's like from 100 years ago or whatever, but it's not. Like my grandmother still remembers getting the right to vote. Like it's these things that are considered like we're supposed to get over or whatever are only 2 generations ago, and we're still being affected by it. And we're still like the generational trauma is still happening between us. So I was asked to make a comic about resistance, and I decided to make a comic about Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, because I didn't want to show resistance or reconciliation through the Canadian government's eyes. I wanted to show what we did, because Yukon First Nations stood up and they fought for our rights, and we won. And for that, I am forever grateful. And I think it's really important to share this information because, like I said, I don't think a lot of people know about it. Another thing that I've been doing is making comics about sports, Arctic sports and Indigenous sports. So last year, it was supposed to be the 50th anniversary of the Arctic Winter Games. But unfortunately, it was going to happen, and then COVID happened, and then it got canceled all within like 2 weeks. But the art show that was in celebration of the 50th anniversary still happened, and I still made these comics. So I made 5 out of the 16 Indigenous sports for the Arctic Winter Games. So, excuse me, these comics just are pretty much the rules, and they explain what each sport is and how to win and how points are made. And yeah, they're pretty entertaining to watch. If you've ever seen any videos, there's tons on YouTube. The knuckle hop is probably the most intense one. I cannot get over it. When I was a kid, I was first introduced to these sports by these like groups that would come to each community, and they would like they would bring all the like sport supplies, like the snow snakes or the seal balls and all these like sports memorabilia, or like paraphernalia, I guess, to do these things. And we got to practice them in our gym class. And then if you were really inclined and interested in it, you could join the team to play in the next Arctic Winter Games. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about, the 1 foot high kick. There's a seal ball, and you're supposed to kick it with one leg, and then you're supposed to land on the same leg that you kicked on. And this is super fun. It's also really hard. It really stretches out your leg. Here's another one, a pole push. These are Arctic and Dene games. So it's not only just like the Arctic games, but it's also the Dene people. So it's not just like Yukon and Nunavut and Northwest Territories First Nations playing these games. It's also people in like Ontario and Saskatchewan and Alberta, like all over Canada. Indigenous people played these games, and I have such a close like I hold these really close to my heart, specifically stick gambling. Excuse me, which I did not make a comic of, but I do have plans to make a comic of it for my graphic novel I told you about, Quandar. So I thought it was really important when I was asked to contribute to this show that I wanted to like show how fun these sports are, and how Indigenous people find identity within these sports. I'm just gonna share, this is my final couple of slides. So this was a comic I was asked to contribute to a magazine called Root and Stem, and Pinagok, the like educational organization. It's their magazine, and it's distributed throughout all northern communities in Canada. So it's like a free magazine for libraries, essentially. And I think even the public can just request for a free issue, and they'll mail you a free issue. So the new issue, which is supposed to come out at the end of this month, is about video games. So they approached me asking to make a comic, a 4-page comic about Indigenous representation in video games. And I thought this was a perfect time to talk about Turok. For those who know about my work, I do this series called Indigenating Comics, and it's a zine, it's like a fanzine where I kind of like rip and tear apart really racist comics and Indigenous representation, if it's good or bad, and self-representation too. So I talk a lot about Indigenous comics like Gord, like his work. And it's funny because like a couple of years ago, I had a panel with Gord at VanCaf, and he asked me, he's like, how come you haven't done Turok yet? And I was like, well, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it. I'll get to it. Trust me. So this is kind of like, Gord, this is it. This is sort of my introduction to showing people how messed up Turok is. So for those who don't know, it was originally a 60s comic about these two indigenous people, and they're like stuck in like the land of the lost, which is like the like Jurassic World essentially, and there's like dinosaurs everywhere. And it's just a comic to like have like the noble savage like murder dinosaurs, and it's pretty senseless. But in the 90s, more famously, it was turned into a video game for the Nintendo 64. And it was kind of my introduction to seeing Indigenous representation in video games as a child. So the title, Just Like Us, is a quote that my brother Andrew said to me as a child when we were playing it, where I was like, whoa, this guy looks native. And my brother was like, don't you know, he is native, just like us. And I remember thinking, well, if he looks like this and we look like that, why, like, how are we both indigenous? And that comes from a lot of misinterpretation of indigenous people and representation of indigenous people in media, where you can essentially just put a feather on the back of your head and, you know, say that you're native. And it's like this really stereotypical way of representing indigenous people, and it's just, you know, it's just racist essentially. It's just like red face. But it's like a very common thing, and even today, you know, like there's still sports teams that have like chiefs as their mascot, or even like high schools. There's high schools all over like United States that still use it. So it's kind of insane to me that like there's a lot of like red face is normalized, but black face is considered like, you know, horrible and disgusting. Yellow face too. But like we're normalized to like the extreme racism that indigenous people face. So this comic kind of like really thoroughly examines that, where I talk about how, you know, even up to 2019 there was a new Turok comic, so there's, or a new Turok video game. So even today people can still like look over there or not even consider it. They don't even think it's wrong to represent indigenous people this way. And then I you know, I further talk about how Turok is supposed to be from the Saquon Nation, from Oklahoma. And the fact is, Oklahoma has like 40 nations in it. And the company that made Turok could have easily contacted any of those nations and asked to collaborate with them on their character and to make him culturally appropriate. Because, you know, it didn't take me very much research to find out that like the top panel here, like the indigenous people in Oklahoma did not look like that. You know, like they wore shirts. There's so many indigenous or like representation in media where like indigenous people are shirtless. We wear shirts. I'm wearing a shirt right now, you know, like it's so ridiculous to me. You can hear I'm getting worked up over this. So I kind of like dissect Turok, and then I explain that there actually are indigenous or video games like Never Alone, which they used 40 community members of a small rural town in Alaska to create this video game, and it's all culturally appropriate, and it's like a beautiful story. Again, there's another one, Mulaka, which is the Tahuruma tribe, and the people who made it in Chihuahua, Mexico are Tahuruma. And, you know, the main character, it's kind of like a Zelda game, and the main character, you're like a Tahuruma shaman, but the twist on it is like, you know, the shaman is culturally appropriate, and he's also in his nation, and he's like fighting folklore stories that are actually Tahuruma stories, you know. So it's not like he's like this crazy shaman wizard warrior that like is a part of the X-Men or whatever. He's like in his land, in his own culture, speaking his own language. The music's based off Tahuruma music. Is very beautiful. It's like, you know, this is how you should make Indigenous video games. Same with Thunderbird Strike, another one. It's like a woodland style video game where it's like a what's the term? It's like a shooter, like kind of like what's the word? Invaders or whatever. Or Space Invaders. There we go. Sorry. I'm losing my video game card today. And then, you know, like I also explain, Turok's not the only Indigenous misrepresentation. Like there's tons of Indigenous fighters in video games, like T-Hawk and Street Fighter, Michelle Chang and Tekken. And she's half Chinese, half Indigenous. And she's like this weird, like stereotype of a Chinese woman and an Indigenous woman. It's like the weirdest thing ever. Nightwolf in Mortal Kombat, who's Nightwolf was also in like the 90s movie. And then Galda, who's also in Power Stone. And then I kind of wrap this comic being like, I will gladly trade in all those racist stereotypes for these new generation of video game heroes, which, you know, is the girl from Never Alone, the Thunderbird from Thunderbird Strike, and the shaman from Mulaka. Yeah, so that's the end of my slides. Thank you for listening to me ramble. And yeah, I showed you a bunch of stuff that's like not in print yet, but the exciting thing is that it will be next year. And a lot of this, the comics that I just showed you too, have been free to the public to read either in person in galleries or on a website. So I'm really excited to have these collected together as one book, and, you know, more accessible like in stores and to be sold online. You know, people can have a greater acknowledgement of, like, you know, how messed up representation for Indigenous people are in comics and video games and movies. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Cole. I'm really looking forward to these future releases of yours. And I had not heard of those two video games you mentioned that were adequate representation. That's really cool to know. I had the opportunity in Northern Ontario to work with some groups that were empowering Indigenous youth to learn how to code. So hopefully there's a whole other next generation of coders who will be able to make great video games like those ones.
Yeah, I would love that.
So I think we're going to shift gears a little bit and jump into the audience Q&A. So I'll invite all our panelists to hop back on video and unmute yourselves. And if any of the audience members have questions, they can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your toolbar. And if any of our panelists have questions for one another too, I had prepared a few questions, but y'all did such great jobs within your presentations. I think most of mine were pretty much answered. So I'll leave it open for now, and we'll see what we can do here.
I want to say I'm like super psyched for Gord's new book. Like, even if it's just a revised version, I'm so excited for it. Last time I saw Gord, I was trying to convince him to collect his Broken Pencil comics, because the only way to read them is either online on the Broken Pencil website or like going through the old back issues. And collecting my comics right now, I'm realizing how much of a pleasure it is to like have everything together in one book and to all be contained. So let's all convince Gord to collect more of his older work, because it's just as relevant today as it was in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I think it's really important, and I think it deserves to be collected and shared.
Yeah, maybe some point. Right now, this comic though that I'm working on, it's such a time suck, and I have a deadline coming up, and it's all I do for the last few months now is work on this comic. So I'm really looking forward to getting it finished. But it's going to be a lot of new material, and I feel like my artwork's really improved, and it's going to be in color. And it's like, I think this is like, for me, it's like I wanted to redo it because 500 Years comic, it's kind of crude, and there's some poor information. I didn't really have access to a lot of information. So I'm really excited to do proper justice to the history of Indigenous resistance. So that's what I'm really focused on now. And I'm really excited about it. So
Is this year the 10-year anniversary of the book?
I think it was published in 2010.
Okay, so
So
11.
yeah, it's about 11 years, but a lot of the material is actually from like 2005,
Mhm.
2003 even. So it's quite dated, the stuff that I did. Yeah.
Yeah, I walked by Pulp Fiction on Main Street the other day, and they had a copy of your essay, like the essay version,
Right. Yeah.
on display. And I was like really tempted to go in there and buy it because I haven't read the essay version.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a bit different. So that one could be updated too. Right. I guess we're never satisfied with our work. Artists, we're so critical of our own work because we spend so much time with it and we see all the inconsistencies and little mistakes. So we're really hard on ourselves. But other people, I work on a panel for like 5 hours and people will look at it for like 5 seconds, and
Mhm.
on to the next panel. So
So we do have a few questions that came in. I'll read this one from Joy. It sounds like a lot of the artists resonated with what Rachel said around creating zines to survive the pandemic. I'm wondering how else or in what other situations the artists use their art to process feelings.
yeah, I don't know. It's weird. Like if I'm happy, if I feel good, I like to draw. If I'm really angry about something, I go and draw. It's like meditative and it's healing and it allows me to take my mind off of whatever my problem might be and to devote it to something else. And just the physical act of drawing, I find really meditative. So
Yeah, a lot of the work I've been making recently is kind of like reliving memories and like recreating them as comics. And yeah, definitely a part of that is like I don't know, I don't want to say coping because they're not like horrible memories or anything, but it's nice to just like relive them and recreate them. And then also share them too. Like I recently was invited to make a comic um, about the Yukon. So I made a comic about sliding. Like I made a comic about just like sliding down a mountain on a snow machine and a crazy carpet, and it's like a 6-page comic about is just being silly, but it's like a nice childhood memory, and it's nice to like relive those thoughts and kind of just like I guess like curate the memory into a comic and like share the things that you really want people to like absorb, I suppose.
Was anyone else going to jump on there, or shall I move to the next one? Okay, I'll read this one from Lin. Rach, love your work. Super interesting, the queer lexicon, especially with language being such a powerful force and politically charged. Wondering about if you have any thoughts in your experience with queer lexicon in mainland China versus Hong Kong, Taiwan. Is there any clash?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have a I feel like this is a question that's hard to answer for a lot of reasons. But from what I remember in the workshop, like the queer lexicon workshop, I think given the way that people travel through, there was knowledge of what words are used in the mainland, what words are used in Hong Kong, what words are used in Taiwan. And so the lexicon is not to say, oh, we're only going to prioritize one or the other. So I didn't notice too much clash. And then another thing I was going to point out is that we actually have a really interesting title that's like very thick. People call it sort of like the Bible about homosexuality in China, but it's called The History of Homosexuality in China. And it's like this thick, and it documents just like what terms were used and how homosexuality and culture like came to be in China. And one of the things that I remember from that book, that's a term that's quite common, is like tongzi or tongzi, which actually means comrade. And this term was adopted by queer people during the time of communist China. Well, actually, technically China is still in the communist, like it's still a communist, but in the time of Mao, and they adopted the term tongzi as a way to like have a positive connotation around queerness. And so it's like when you say, oh, I'm tongzi or I'm tongzi, it's like, oh, I'm comrade, but also like I'm queer. And so that's what I think of. And that term is used across, I think, Hong Kong, China, and Taiwan. And so I don't think there's necessarily clash, but there's definitely differences, even though the language is technically the same. So that's how I would answer that question. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. We have one more that just came in from Rowan Reimer. I'm really interested in what Rachel talked about, the blue photos around having great material and experience, but a disconnect somewhere that stales a project. Do the other panelists have projects in similar states, waiting for a space and time where they make more sense?
No, not really.
I feel like a lot of artists put things on hold because of the pandemic. I mean, I guess maybe I should talk for myself that I ended up putting something on hold because of this, just to work on something that felt more pertinent, I guess, and just like responding more to what's happening now in my own life. Yeah, no, that answers.
Awesome, thanks so much. I do see one more here in the comment section from Grace Laud. We'll probably wrap things up with this question here. Really great panel. I really liked learning about everyone's work. Rachel, with your work of resistance in Chinatown, any thoughts of how one can center the resistance of gentrification in Chinatown in the context of Indigenous land and anti-colonialism?
This is a big question, and one that I'm also constantly thinking about. So I currently work with Yarrow Intergenerational Society for Justice, which is based in Vancouver's Chinatown. And we work, no worries, no need to apologize, Grace. I think it's a great question. And so we work in Vancouver's Chinatown and the downtown east side. And one of the things that we often talk about is the fact that we're doing this work and it's for settlers, by settlers. But what does it mean that the fact that Chinatown is on like Indigenous land that's unceded? And so one of the values that we have as an organization is to like build Indigenous solidarity and to be able to think through the ways that the issues that Indigenous people face, for example, in the healthcare system, is also faced by Chinese people in the healthcare system, although they are different. But for example, like racism in the healthcare system for Indigenous peoples and Chinese people who don't speak English is a very real thing, and there are similarities. But in terms of thinking through how to center resistance of gentrification in Chinatown, I think it's to recognize that like we can't just focus on one particular community or one act of resistance. It has to be in solidarity with one another. Like you can't have one without the other. And one of the things that I often think about and talk about is like, how can we be good neighbors? And I think in the context of Chinatown, that makes a lot of sense, given the sort of overrepresentation of like houseless folks who are Indigenous in downtown East Side. And so that's how I would answer that question, is like thinking about how can we be a good neighbor and be able to have those movements move forward at the same time and with one another.
Thank you for that answer. That is a big question. So thank you all for your great questions today. And thanks for joining us, of course. And thanks to our 4 panelists, Gord, Rachel, Jenny, and Cole, for their presentations and for creating such inspiring and important work as well. Before we take off today, I would like to remind everyone about a few other future happenings at Griffin Art Projects. So you can join us next Sunday, March 28th at 1 p.m. for a webinar with artist and professor at Ryerson University, Linda Zhang, as she discusses speculative futures of Chinatowns. Also, we're excited to be presenting Who's Chinatown, a virtual conference in collaboration with Center A, the New Gallery, and the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, as well as several other contributors. So this 2-day event will take place virtually the weekend of April 10th and 11th. To register or learn more information on either of these 2 events or other future events, you can visit our website, griffinartprojects.ca. If you'd like to rewatch or share today's panel discussion, as I mentioned at the beginning, it will be available on our website as part of our digital archive, and it should also be available on our YouTube page sometime within the next week. If you're local to Vancouver region and you haven't had the opportunity to check out the current exhibition, Griffin Art Projects is open from 12 to 5 on Saturdays, and you can visit our website to register for your time slot to view that as well. Yeah, so I think we'll wrap things up. So thanks again for everyone joining us, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their Sunday.